Well, welcome back, everybody. My name's Evan.
My name's Andrew.
And we're so glad that you've joined us back on the BCC pod. This is where we take what's happening in our church and what we're learning together and bring it into unscripted conversations that dive a little bit deeper. Whether you're tuning in on your drive at the gym or you're just relaxing at home, we're so glad that you're here. So today we're talking about lust. A super fun topic that everybody wanted to talk about.
That everybody was expecting for sure. Yeah.
Your sermon in 4 words.
Yeah.
If you could break it down into, just a short blurb, what would it be?
Lust is deadly and destructive. That's 4, right? Lust is deadly and destructive.
Yeah, we'll take it.
Sure.
We'll say it's a plus instead of an and.
Okay.
Yeah. Here's the thing, though. Do you want to burn that on this weekend? Because if you come in here next weekend and you say, wrath is deadly and destructive, I'm going to call you out on it.
Fine. I only get it for this one. Next week I can't just use all these sins are deadly and destructive. Yeah.
We were talking about lust, talking about how it's deadly, how it's destructive. Do you want to give a bit of a recap of your main point and challenge this past weekend?
Sure. So my main point was really that lust is deadly and destructive, that it's something that's really unhealthy and it's actually really harmful. I think our world sometimes sees lust as something like spicy that can spice up things when really it's self-centered, it's selfish, it's destructive. And my challenge then was to live with self-control, to not let this untamed kind of desire, that's sometimes what lust is seen as like too much of a desire, and to not let that just get out of control, but instead to practice self-control. Yeah.
For those who might be listening that didn't get a chance or haven't gotten a chance to listen to your sermon or who weren't there, can you give a little bit of a just define terms a little bit, like what's the difference between lust and desire? Is lust only talking about sexuality and all that sort of stuff, or is it broader than that? Do you want to just give a little bit of a brief?
Sure. So, yeah, for sure. Definition of lust might be to say that it's an intense craving or desire for something. And that relates to sexuality or to sex, but it's not only about that, because you can have like a lust for life, you can have like a lust for power or ambition, and it's to have really an intense craving or desire for something. So that's kind of what it is. And I would say it's probably even more than intense, but an unhealthy desire. Like it's way too much. And that's where the difference between like a desire for sex is fine, but lust is where it gets into something that is unmanageable, unhelpful, and unhealthy.
Yeah. I think what we'll probably find too as we go throughout these is that sort of is a recurring theme with the 7 deadly sins, that like inherently not bad, but can be unhealthy, right? Yeah. Like in the same way that like desire is different than lust, anger is different than wrath, like those sort of things. Yeah. Like it's, as we talk, I'm reminded of like the dose makes the poison in certain ways. And there's a difference between like desiring things, but being consumed by them, or the desire for them being something that you start to lose control of.
I think that's also, we'll get into this one, but that's really true also with gluttony. That gluttony is really the wanting of too much of a good thing. Like food is good, that's great, but too much of it is not healthy. Yeah. And it can relate to, as we'll see when we get into it, it'll relate to so much more than just food. There's lots of good things, like wanting to chill out and watch Netflix is a good thing. Too much of it is a bad thing, right? Yeah. When you're just binging season after season, that's actually unhealthy. So I think that idea that, it's too much of something applies a lot in a lot of these different kind of sins or categories of sin that we'll look at.
Yeah. So getting into cut for time, is there anything that you wanted to get into that you didn't have time for? Any topics that you wanted to cover that just didn't make the final cut?
Yeah. So one of the topics that didn't make the final cut but would have been helpful, I think, in some ways, I did mention it a few times, it's just that I think the Western Evangelicals Church's stance when it's come to lust has been unhealthy in a lot of ways. That really what it's done is create like a purity culture where all of a sudden sex is taboo or sex is wrong or sex is dirty in some way. I didn't really get into it in this sermon because it wasn't as applicable, but I just don't think those things are true. And I also think that when it's come then to lust, what the Western Evangelical Church has done is it stood against lust, but has not been so careful to not also say, hey, but like sex as a desire is not bad or wrong or dirty or shameful or anything like that. Yeah. And that lust is really too much of it. That's what we're talking kind of through.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true. Cause I think there is like older generations, you didn't talk about sex, and culture was much different than it is now. It feels like, a lot of purity culture is overcorrection, right? Of we're going to overcorrect to these things that we're uncomfortable with in culture. And if there are people who are listening or who listen to your sermon that are kind of in the process of like unwinding purity culture and a bad kind of script around sexuality that they've been given, what kind of advice would you have for them?
So some of the advice I might have is actually go back to the Bible and what the Bible actually teaches. That so often, I think sometimes what ends up happening is we get handed scripts that aren't necessarily even scriptural. And instead they're more cultural. Instead they're more, people's takes on things. And I would go back to the Bible and about what God originally designed between Adam and Eve was called good. And everything was good in that period. And so sex was good too. So anything that starts off with the tone, I think, of shame or guilt, I don't really believe is healthy or helpful for us to be able to be following Christ. That God doesn't use those kind of modes of voice or tones of voice. He can convict, and conviction, though, says that we've done something wrong. Guilt or shame often says we are wrong, and those are different things and very different things. And I think for someone who's unraveling that, to try to start to realize that things were created good, that perhaps you're handed a script that wasn't as healthy or scriptural, and just to remember that God doesn't speak in that tone of voice of guilt or condemnation or shame, making you feel bad for who you are, rather than he definitely convicts us of sin. Like that's what this whole series is about. But there's a difference between conviction and guilt and shame and condemnation.
I think too, the guilt and shame often focus on like the incident, whereas like conviction focuses on flourishing out of that. That I think oftentimes the approach that we see in Scripture looks like, not one of trying to keep people in that space they're in, which is often what guilt and shame does. Conviction says like, how do you come out of that, and how do you find kind of freedom and flourishing from those things?
And I like that idea, because that's even what we're trying to do with this series. The point isn't to make people feel guilty for sins, but to actually find freedom and forgiveness from these big 7 categories of sin that just hamper us and trip us up. As Hebrews talks about, we should throw away the sin that so easily entangles us. That's what this stuff does. So let's like live in freedom from it. And guilt and shame, I like that idea of keeps us kind of wrapped in it rather than actually allowing us to find freedom and forgiveness from it.
Yeah, there's a really good Hillary McBride quote. I'm probably not going to get 100% correct, but she says something to the effect of like spiritual control and abuse is someone handing you the voice of shame and telling you it's the voice of God. And I think oftentimes that whether intentional or not, because there are some people like that were caught up in purity culture just like that weren't malicious. Like it was just the prevailing kind of thing and the way things were. And, but that within kind of purity culture and teachings that, you're being handed something that isn't the voice of God, but is being told to you that it is. And that is a hard thing to unravel. But I think, the work on the other side is really, or the outcome on the other side is really great. Before we move on today, we just want to give a little bit of a promo and an ad for a new podcast that we're going to be releasing that is a special edition. So it'll only be around for the season of Lent. And every week for the next 6 weeks, we're going to be releasing just about a 10-minute guided meditation and reflection for you to use in coordination with your spiritual practices that you have throughout the week. So this will be quick 10-minute podcasts that just focus on whatever we were talking about the previous Sunday. So tomorrow it'll get released and it'll be a meditation on lust. The goal of these is really to help you dive a little bit deeper into your own personal life and take what we've been learning on Sundays and what we would have learned the weekend prior and actually begin to apply it and examine your life to see how you can find freedom and liberation and more connectedness to Jesus with these things. So that will release every Thursday for the next 6 weeks. Make sure to check it out and make sure to subscribe so you get notifications if you haven't already. Yeah, and let us know what you think of it. So we got some questions for you today.
Okay.
We actually got some good questions. Not that we don't have good questions other weeks,
Not that
but
there's
these
other
ones
ones that we're judging as bad.
Yeah. Everyone who sends in questions, they're amazing. We love them. So the first one deals with kind of cultural impact. In your sermon, you talk about how lust is normalized in culture and kind of the challenge that brings up. So how can Christians practically guard their hearts while still engaging with the culture?
I think the big thing is just to really be thinking through of what are we allowing into our hearts, our minds, I think especially of the type of things that we consume, specifically around so what are we scrolling through? What's kind of pops up on that? What are we watching? That I actually think lust at its core, it's very consumeristic and it's consumption based. Tim Keller has this great quote where he says, "Lust distorts the gift of love and makes it about control and consumption, not giving." So I would just want to say when it's about that, is to think through really what are you consuming in terms of the media you're consuming, in terms of some of the books you're reading even, or shows you're watching, how much lust is a part of it. And just be careful, because if you let in a little bit, it has the habit of growing. And I think that kind of reviewing and thinking through what it is you're consuming is a good way to start to practically figure out how to guard your heart or mind from some of the stuff within our world while still engaging in our world. You still have Netflix, but maybe just, what are you watching on Netflix? You can still have your phone and be on TikTok, but just what are the main things that are coming up in your feed? That's indicative of kind of where you might be at. So I just think, to think through those things.
Yeah. As you talk, I'm thinking about the fact that what one person might think is too far might be different for another person. When it comes to these sort of things that are more subjective, right? The Bible is not telling you not to watch a certain show, right? And where there might be differences in how you kind of guard your heart and your life versus how I do, or vice versa. What do we do with that? And how do we go about that in kind of a healthy and a good way?
Yeah. So what I would say with that is I think that's really wise, that there's a lot of differences in people and just, a lot of different things. So with this, I think this is where it comes down to listening to the Holy Spirit and actually asking the Spirit to discern with us, okay, what is healthy for me? What is unhealthy for me? What is right? What is wrong? And when it comes to film or something, there might be, for some people, there might be some films that are wrong. There are others that might be okay. I just think art is a really subjective reality. And so with that, then inviting the Spirit to say, even taking a few moments, this would be a good Lenten practice to just reflect with the Spirit even this week and say, is there anything that I should be cutting out? Is there anything that isn't healthy for me? Is there anything in light of my, Andy Stanley once talked about my background, my experiences, who I am, that would be wise for me just to say no to, because our experiences are often very, very different. And so I think, taking that process, asking the Spirit to guide us, and really what the Spirit does is it helps us by asking different questions rather than right or wrong. That as you grow closer to Christ, there's still right and wrong. Obviously, there's sins and there's 10 commandments and there's all of that. But there's also the questions of, is this wise? Or is this healthy? Or is this even holy for us? And I think those are better questions than just right or wrong, because there is gray in our world. And I would want to, you'd be asking the Spirit, is it wise? Is it healthy? Is it holy? And letting Him direct you in that. Yeah.
I think too that sometimes we think of the guarding our hearts and think about that kind of conversation in terms of shock value lust than we do in terms of the lust that we normalize. So I think a good practice too is, as you were talking about how lust is not just sexual, right? Our minds jump to what are the TV shows I'm watching that have nudity in them, or what are the right? But what are the ways that I am glorifying power and the hoarding of power in my life, or the gaining of it, and what are the ways that lust is present in my life in ways that aren't just the go-to things that we jump to, that are more blatant, I guess is a better word to use for it.
Or to give a shout out for the next sermon, we're going to talk about greed, and there is so much lust for greed, and all sorts of areas in our lives. And we just said like, that's okay. Because I think consumerism runs our culture. And I think that too can be a form or a craving of lust, right? Lust is an intense desire for something. And sometimes what we want is more money, more power, more fame, whatever. And so just to think through, is that a part of our lives? Is that a part of what we are consuming as a culture?
Yeah.
And I think it is.
Yeah. The next one, the next question we have talks about just kind of church and purity culture. So you mentioned that the church has sometimes mishandled the topic of lust, creating shame and guilt. How can churches have healthier conversations about sexuality and sin?
Yeah, I think where purity culture goes wrong, and if you're not familiar with that, it's kind of mean the more moralistic kind of interpretations of things. And this is what I tried to get at Sunday, and hopefully this might have been helpful for people. It's just that temptation is not sin. And I think purity culture equates temptation to sin.
Yeah.
And temptation really isn't. It says that Jesus was tempted in all ways, yet he did not sin. So I just think even in the teaching on Sunday, that's what I was trying to get across, that it's not wrong to be tempted. And you don't always have control over that. Sometimes we put ourselves in really silly or stupid situations, but we don't always have control over the different temptations that we face, and that's not sinful to face a temptation and then to say no to it, or to practice self-control, or even to be momentarily thinking of something and then trying to switch out of that gear. Like that actually is what, like discipleship looks like. Focusing on temptation, what it actually can do is actually empower the temptation more. And then what you do is it also layers upon it that if temptation is sin, which it isn't, but if that's what's kind of going on in your head, then it's very easy to make that jump from temptation is sin to I'm terrible because I can't stop these feelings from happening. Then I'm sinful. And then that's where the voice of like shame can speak really, really loudly, as if there's a problem within us, rather than saying, no, temptation is not sin. And when I resist temptation, that's actually what holiness looks like. And that emotions also aren't sinful. We'll get into this with the sermon on anger, but I think this applies to the sermon on lust, where Paul says, in your anger, do not sin. Like, you can feel angry, but then what you do with it is what you're responsible for. Right? And the same thing with lust. There might be a thought that comes to you, but what you do with that thought, whether you engage it, whether you actively kind of stoke it or indulge in it, those things really matter. And I think that can be helpful to even that previous question of disentangling purity culture, that temptation is not sin.
Yeah. The next question we have is, how do we navigate the tension between resisting sin and understanding that temptation itself is not sin? So we could probably just skip that one.
I think we got to cover that one. That's a good question. You just proleptically answered it.
The next question we have is, for someone struggling with lust, what are some first tangible steps they can take towards real freedom and healing?
The first thing I would say is I think there are a few things. I think there is first confession. Confession to God is the first step. I think we should go to him. I think especially when we feel shameful or when we feel guilt-ridden, sometimes what we do, and we see this in Genesis, is we hide from God rather than going to God, right? That when Adam and Eve get caught out, they actually are hiding from him because they know they've done something wrong. But the right response would have been to go and ask for forgiveness. And I just think that it's really important for us to practice that practice, especially in Lent, of confession, saying to God, this is where I've screwed up, this is where I've messed up, can you forgive me? And 1 John 1:9 says that he is faithful and just to cleanse us and forgive us of all of our unrighteousness or wickedness or sin. And so I think one of the first things practically is the practice of confession. I then also think that things like celebrate recovery and spaces where we journey together with one another with some accountability, but not in the top-down like kind of version of it, but more with the mutual support is really, really important to it, especially if there's anything that's become a habit. Breaking habits is really, really hard. We just know that it's really easy to form bad ones, and it's really hard to break bad ones. And that's where I think confession and support from other people is really important. Yeah.
I think one of the things that comes to my mind is like, first things first, you can tell yourself that this is so normal, that like so many people struggle with this and go through this, and that I think sometimes like one of the first ways to start to kind of undo and to push back against shame is to recognize that like that it's okay, like that you'll figure this out, and that because so many people have worked through this before you and will after you, and and then to to tell somebody about it
Yeah.
and to start to move in that direction.
Yeah. And I like that idea of remembering that you're not the only one who's ever gone through this,
Yeah.
right? And that also gives hope that you're not the only one who's ever gone through this, so that there is ways to grow and ways to find freedom and forgiveness and all of that.
Our last question for today is centered around the next generation. So this one says, how can parents and church leaders equip young people to develop a biblical and healthy understanding of sexuality without instilling fear or guilt? And maybe as someone with kids that are growing up and are getting older, what are your kind of values as you approach conversations with your kids, or as you approach kind of figuring out how to teach them around sexual ethic and sexuality as a whole?
Yeah. So we try to have really open conversations with our kids. And by meaning of that, and I mean conversations, not as if having one conversation and done as if you've somehow now instilled all the right values or whatever else, but having open lines of communication. And I think, too, just talking directly about things. I won't speak for him, but our oldest was in the sermon on Sunday, and he did chatter back quite a bit, actually, to kind of Chris the spot, which was great. But he heard that sermon.
Son.
Yeah, he's still my son for sure. He heard that sermon too on Sunday, and so we talked about it on the way home. Like, it just made sense to, right? Like, why would we not? And we had a great conversation on the way home. So I just think having more conversations is actually usually the best way, and being direct about it, saying, do you have any questions? And being open, and also just being there for them. So for me, like real vulnerability, openness, ongoing conversations, not just kind of one and done kind of a thing, really matter for teaching the next generation. And I especially think in relationship to things like pornography or with like phones and how easy it is to have sexual realities that are unhealthy, having those conversations early with your kids, especially if you're going to have access to media, then that really, really matters. And that might be the good I don't know, guideline for when you give your kids a phone is when you're able to have those conversations around media, because they're going to have access to things that perhaps are not going to be as healthy for them. So, yeah.
I think that's super good. I think too, like, what you're kind of getting at, like the idea of shame thriving in darkness, that this idea that like the things that we kind of push away and don't want to talk about, or like that we feel uncomfortable talking about, that only makes it worse if we don't. And that I think talking about sex and sexuality in a normalized way with your kids, again, this is coming from somebody who doesn't have kids, but I think talking about sex and sexuality in a normalized way, not in a way that diminishes the value to these things, is important, but like having open lines of communication with your kids, you being people in your kids' lives that they feel comfortable asking any question to, will serve you really well in the long term, I think.
Yeah.
And will serve them in the long term too.
And we've seen that with our family, that it's just been valuable to have those open lines of communication. I mean, in our family, it might be a little bit different, that my wife's profession leads to lots of questions around, she's a midwife, so she's birthing babies. And so where do babies come from? Well, she's going to discuss, what do you do for a job, Mom? Like that stuff is going to come up, which I think is good that it gets normalized, without lessening the value or the importance of those conversations. Yeah. And if the topic is important, it probably means we should talk about it, probably more than once. And to have an open lines of communication really matter. Yeah.
Not to mention, too, that like I love the idea of that being an ongoing conversation and something that is kind of never just like put down and put away. Because like as your kids change and grow, that conversation will change and grow, too. That like their children are rapidly changing all the time, and they go through so many stages in that first section of life there with you, right? So how you approach that conversation, how you talk about it, is going to look different based on where they're at. So having an open kind of ongoing conversation leaves space for that, I think.
And for Krista and I, we just made a commitment very, very early when I was a youth pastor and didn't have children. And then when we just had, just Hudson, we made the commitment that we want to talk about sex and sexuality enough with our kids that they will go to us before Googling anything. Like, we want to be the people that are going to help them interpret that information. I don't want them to be learning that online by themselves or, in some other avenue. We want to be the first conversation that sets the tone for those things. So we just kind of made that commitment really early with our kids. We're going to talk about it openly, and get them to come to us. So if they have questions, that they come to us first. That's our kind of our yardstick for what healthy parenting in that would look like.
Yeah. I think that's so good. So upcoming, heading into this week, what are we looking at?
We're going to be taking a look at the sin of greed, which is pretty prevalent in our culture. But the real thing we're going to take a look at is then how do we live with generosity? How do we live with generosity of spirit, generosity of life, generosity with our finances, for sure. That includes all of that. But yeah, the real focus would be on generosity.
Cool. Well, that is a wrap for today. Thanks so much for hanging out with us. We love having these conversations, but they're even better when you're a part of them. So if you've got questions, thoughts, or topics you'd love to hear about, just shoot us a text. You can text our church phone number, 905-937-5300. And we'd love to hear your questions and chat about them on the pod. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the BCC pod so you never miss an episode. And if you're enjoying the podcast, do us a favor and leave a quick rating or review. It's a really simple way to help others find this podcast and be encouraged as well. So that's all we got for today. We will see you on Sunday and back here next week. Bye, guys.